This is Dr. Ken with a lecture from my Ancient Greece module, though anyone is welcome to watch this who wishes, that I'm titling Chaos or Cosmos, Mythological and Cosmological Thought. So we have seen already how the ancient Greeks tried to understand their universe through mythology. Now we're going to turn to a different approach that they took, or some of them took, through the uses of philosophy and how it developed. So today we are primarily talking about the pre-Socratic philosophers, those who come before Socrates, and their attempts through observation, but also speculation, to understand the universe around them. So the first group of these philosophers that I'll discuss are known as the Ionians. And these were a group that were situated in Asia Minor, that's currently the west coast of modern-day Turkey, whose views were influenced both by the Greeks but also the Near Eastern ideas. It was a curious combination of East meets West, and we know a little bit about the Persians and their thinking around this time. The Zoroastrian religion largely dominated in Persia. It was a dualistic religion, and a philosophy as well that believed in a kind of good God and an evil demon deity that the good god Ahura Mazda would defeat. There was a kind of order of the cosmos that was imposed, and it was the great king's duty, the Shah of Persia, to make sure that this order, they called it Arta, which means the truth, was replicated in reality. These views and other views from the East were influential on the Greeks, and there were Greek city-states, as we know, in Ionia. But what would come of them, the philosophers that would arise in these, their ideas would be utterly incompatible with what the Persians understood, and they would flee, in many cases, to the West and bring with them these philosophical ideas that they've been developing. So we'll look at several key ones, and you can see on the map the Greek city-states and where many of these people originated. As the Persians are taking over those Greek city-states in Asia Minor, a number of Greeks, including Herodotus, our first historian, fled to mainland Greece or further. The first philosopher I want to talk about is Thales of Miletus, circa 624 to 545 BC. He's counted as one of the seven sages. Many, most notably Aristotle, regarded him as the first philosopher in the Greek tradition. According to Bertrand Russell, a modern philosopher, philosophy begins with Thales. He attempted to explain natural phenomena without reference to mythology and was tremendously influential in this respect. Almost all other pre-Socratic philosophers follow him in attempting to provide an explanation of ultimate substance, change, and the existence of the world. And this is something the Ionians and other philosophers were looking for, an ultimate substance that could explain how the universe worked. Again, without reference to mythology. Those philosophers were also influential, and eventually Thales' rejection of mythological explanations became an essential idea for the scientific revolutions that would follow. He's also the first to try and define general principles and set forth hypotheses. And as a result, he's been dubbed the father of science, though it's argued that Democritus is actually more deserving of this title. Thales, however, aimed to explain natural phenomena via rational explanation, and that referenced natural processes themselves. For example, he attempted to explain earthquakes by hypothesizing that the earth floats on water, and that earthquakes occur when the earth is rocked by waves, rather than assuming that the earthquakes are the actions of gods or giants or something like that beneath the earth, or some other supernatural process. And he seems to have placed a great deal of emphasis on water. But water perhaps not as we know it. So he's characterized as a hylozoist, who thinks matter, and particularly water, is alive. It's unclear whether the interpretation that he he treated matter as being alive might have been mistaken for his thinking the properties of nature arise directly from natural processes, more consistent with modern ideas of how properties arise as emergent characteristics of complex systems, but that may be projecting too much of modern ideas onto him. But still, the explanation for earthquakes it's not far from what we know to be the case with plate tectonics and the Earth surface, the crust floating on a liquid, effectively, layer underneath in the mantle. So Thales, according to, and we have nothing from Thales himself. We only have what others recorded of him, mostly Aristotle. And Aristotle said that he asked what was the nature, the Greek word is arche, the sort of ultimate origin of the object, so that it should behave in its characteristic way. And so first principles is what he's looking for. And water, apparently, is Thales' idea of a first principle. And this forms the basis of his cosmological thesis, cosmological study of the cosmos, how it works, which held that the world started from water. Aristotle considered this belief roughly equivalent to the later idea of Anaximenes, who held that everything was composed of air. The best explanation for Thales' view is the following passage from Aristotle's Metaphysics. The passage contains words from the theory of matter and from form that were adopted by science and with quite different meanings. But this is what he writes: that from which is everything that exists, and from which it first becomes, and into which it is rendered at last, its substance remaining under it, but transforming in qualities that they say is the element and principle of things that are. For it is necessary that there be some nature, physis, remember that word, either one or more than one, from which become the other things of the object being saved. Thales, the founder of this type of philosophy, says that it's water. That, referring to saving the phenomenon, this is actually the beginning of scientific methodology. To save the phenomenon means to make a model, usually a mathematical model, of how something in nature works, to save it, if you like, with recourse to some written either theorem or theory. So an example of saving the phenomenon would be coming up with a mathematical interpretation or a mathematical equation to describe how the moon goes around the Earth, or the phases of the moon, or something along those lines, or stellar positions. So this is saving the phenomenon. It is really the beginning of the scientific method. Essentially, a later writer, Diogenes Laertius, who gives us a biography of Thales, and we'll be looking at him later with Pythagoras, he says that Thales said that water constituted the principle of all things. Another philosopher, Heraclitus Homericus, a 1st century AD grammarian, not to be confused with a different Heraclitus we'll be talking about in a bit, states that Thales drew conclusions from seeing moist substance turn into air, slime, and earth. It seems likely that Thales viewed the earth as solidifying out of water, on which it floated and which surrounded by ocean. So he sees water as sort of transforming into other things. Different philosophers will take different approaches. So the next one we want to talk about is Anaximander of Miletus. His view of what constitutes the universe is referred to as the unbounded, the apeiron, that which has no boundary. He's the author of the first surviving lines of Western philosophy that we have, from him. He speculated and argued about the boundless as the origin of all that is. He also worked on the fields of what we now call geography and biology. Moreover, Anaximander was the first speculative astronomer. He originated the world picture of the open universe, which replaced the closed universe of the celestial vault. The celestial vault was a commonly held philosophical position or religious position, which can be identified as amongst the ancient Israelites. You find it referred to in the Bible, the vault of heaven. The idea is that the earth, the cosmos, essentially as we know it, exists within a kind of stone vault, extraordinarily large stone vault, and beyond it is water and light. and there are holes in the vault through which water comes. Water pours through them. It's where the rain comes from, according to this idea, and light, and those are the stars. But Anaximander does away with this. And he was also the first who dared to write a treatise in prose, which has been traditionally called On Nature. Again, we don't have this book. We only have excerpts from it, from different people. It was probably available in the library of Aristotle. Well, we're pretty sure it was available in Aristotle's library at the Lyceum, read by Aristotle himself and his successors. According to Aristotle and Theophrastus, a successor of Aristotle, again, the first philosophers were looking for the principle or origin of things, the Greek word arche again. Anaximander said it was the unlimited, the apeiron, that which has no boundary. And in ancient times, it's complained that Anaximander did not explain what he meant by the unbounded. The only existing fragment of his book we have says, "Whence things have their origin, thence also their destruction happens, as is the order of things. For they execute the sentence upon one another, the condemnation for the crime in conformity with the ordinance of time." Aristotle reports a curious argument, which probably goes back to Anaximander, in which he argued that the boundless has no origin because it itself is the origin. We would say that it looks more like a string of associations and wordplay rather than formal argument, but it runs as follows. Everything has an origin, or is an origin. The boundless has no origin, for then it would have a limit. Because it's boundless, it doesn't have a limit. Moreover, it is both unborn and immortal, being a kind of origin. For that which has become has also necessarily an end, and there is a termination to every process of destruction. Since the boundless has no end or no beginning, it is essentially everything itself. It seems to have played a role in Anaximander's account of the origin of the cosmos. And we can discern at least three astronomical speculations that derive from his philosophy. One, that the celestial bodies make full circles and pass beneath the earth, that the earth itself floats free and unsupported in space, and that the celestial bodies lie behind one another. Notwithstanding their rather primitive outlook, these three propositions, which make up the core of Anaximander's astronomy, meant a tremendous leap forward and constitute the origin of our Western concepts of the universe. Many authors have pointed out to the fact that this is the first known example of an argument that is based on the principle of sufficient reason, the principle that for everything which occurs there is a reason or explanation for why it occurs, one way rather than the other. So interesting. They're not getting it quite right, but they're approaching something like a modern scientific explanation. The next one is Anaximenes of Miletus. I mentioned him earlier. He believed in air as somehow the basic principle of everything. And he, like a number of the others that we've been talking about, believed in what's called material monism, that everything is derived from one thing ultimately. So the tendency to identify one specific underlying reality made up of a natural thing constitutes the bulk of the contributions for which Anaximenes is most famed. While his predecessors, Thales and Anaximander, proposed that the arche, the underlying material world, were made of water, or the ambiguous unlimited thing, the apeiron, Anaximenes asserted that air was the most basic stuff of which all other things were made. To him, air was not just one of the four basic elements, as Aristotle would consider them, but was the substance from which all things came and to which they would eventually return. While the choice may seem arbitrary to us, he based his conclusion on naturally observable phenomena in the process of rarefication and condensation. So think about water condensing out of the air. When air condenses, it becomes visible as mist and then rain and forms precipitation, or as the condensed air cools. Anaximenes supposed that it went up to form earth and ultimately stones and everything else. In contrast, water evaporates into the air, which ignites and produces flame, then further rarefied. While other philosophers also recognized such transitions in states of matter, Anaximenes was the first to associate the quality of pairs, hot and dry, cold and wet, with the density of a single material, and add a quantitative dimension to the Milesian monistic system. Having concluded that everything in the world is composed of air, Anaximenes then used his theory to devise a scheme explaining the origins and nature of the earth as well as the surrounding celestial bodies. So air felted somehow to create the flat disk of earth, and he believes the earth is a flat disk, which was said to be table-like and behaved like a leaf floating on the air. In keeping with prevailing views of celestial bodies as balls of fire in the sky, he proposed the earth let out an exhalation of air that rarefied and ignited and became the stars, while the sun is similarly described as being a flame. It's not composed of rarefied air like the stars, but rather of earth like the moon. Its burning comes from its composition, but rather not from its composition, from its rapid motion, apparently. The moon and sun are likewise considered to be flat and floating on streams of air, and when the sun sets it does not pass under the earth, it merely is obscured by the higher parts of the earth as it circles round and becomes more distant. So this is his account of how these things work. We come next to perhaps one of the most important of the pre-Socratics, who came up with some ideas that are still with us today and still highly relevant. These all are, but this one is perhaps more so. Anaxagoras. Born in Klatsomeni in Asia Minor, he was the first philosopher to bring philosophy from Ionia to Athens. So he traveled to Athens and spread his ideas. He attempted to give a scientific account of eclipses, meteors, rainbows, and the sun, which he described the sun itself as a fiery mass larger than the Peloponnese. He was accused of contravening the established religious views and was forced to flee from Athens under pain of death, because of course the sun is a god. He's famous for introducing the cosmological concept of nous, which means mind, as an ordering force. He regarded material substance as an infinite multitude of imperishable primary elements, referring all generation and disappearance to mixture and separation, respectively. Anaxagoras brought philosophy and the spirit of scientific inquiry from Ionia to Athens. His observations of the celestial bodies and the fall of meteorites led him to new theories of universal order. He attempted to give a scientific account of eclipses, meteors, rainbows, and the sun, which, as again he describes as a large burning mass. He was also the first to explain that the moon shines due to reflected light from the sun. He also said that the moon had mountains, and he believed that it was inhabited. The heavenly bodies, he asserted, were masses of stone torn from the earth and ignited by rapid rotation. He explained that both sun and stars were fiery stones. We do not feel the heat of the stars because of their enormous distance from the earth, he said. He thought that the earth was flat and floats supported by strong air under it, and disturbances in the air sometimes caused earthquakes, so not quite right in that respect. However, these theories brought him into collision with popular faith. His view on such things as heavenly bodies were considered dangerous. He was arrested, but his ally in Athens was Pericles, a prominent politician who managed to secure his release, and he would then flee and spend the rest of his days in the city of Lampascus. The people there erected an altar to Mind in his honor. He also argued that the ultimate origin of things were seeds, he called them, spermata, or miniatures. So, but he thought of miniatures of things like wheat and flesh and gold and other primitive items. But these parts of like nature with their wholes had to be eliminated from the complex mass before they could receive a definite name and character, and mind then arranges them to form in segregating like from unlike. So some interesting ideas from Anaxagoras. Mind causes motion as well, and you can see the beginning of the kind of the logos as a kind of supreme ordering thing of the cosmos. Next, I'll talk about Heraclitus. He's one of the more influential ones, particularly on Plato, if only because Plato disagreed profoundly with him and sought to oppose him. So Heraclitus of Ephesus, is a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher native to the Greek city of Ephesus. He was of distinguished parentage. Little is known about his early life and education, but he regarded himself as self-taught and a pioneer of wisdom. He led apparently a fairly lonely life and preferred to sit around pondering philosophy by himself, separated from humankind. He was known as the obscure and sometimes the weeping philosopher. He's famous for his doctrine of change being central to the universe, as stated in the famous saying, "You cannot step twice into the same stream." He wrote about the unity of opposites, stating that the path up and down are one and the same, existing things being characterized by pairs of contrary properties, and other explorations of the concept of dualism, and this is that Eastern concept of dualism influencing Greek philosophy. His cryptic utterance that all things come to be in accordance with the logos, literally, remember, word, reason, or account, has been the subject of numerous interpretations. We have the quote saying, "The idea that all things come to pass in accordance with this logos, and that the logos is common, expressed in these fragments of his." We don't really know what he meant by this, but something similar perhaps to Anaxagoras and the notion of mind ordering the cosmos. The meaning of logos is also, as I say, subject to multiple interpretation. As we know from last time, it can mean things like word, account, plan, formula, measure, proportion, reckoning, logic. Though Heraclitus quite deliberately plays on the various meanings of logos, there's no compelling reason to suppose that he's using it in a special or technical sense, significantly different from the way it was used in other Greeks, by other Greeks of his time. One statement that's alleged to have come from him, although we don't have a quote saying that he said this, apart from people believing it, is that everything is flowing, everything's in a state of flux. It's used to characterize his philosophy. It comes from Simplicius, a Neoplatonist of a later era, and from Plato's Cratylus. Meaning the word in Greek, ta panta re, everything flows. The word re means to stream, and we do have these references from Heraclitus that seem to agree with this, though. He writes, in the fragments that survive, he says, "Ever newer waters flow on those who step into the same river." And then another, "All things move and nothing remains still. Everything changes and nothing remains still, and you cannot step twice into the same stream." The assertion of flow, the assertions of flow are coupled in many fragments with the enigmatic river usage. So another one says, "We both step and do not step into the same river as we are and are not." So his flux doctrine appears to be a case of the unity of opposites, pointing to ways in which things are both the same and not the same over time. He depicts two key opposites that are interconnected but not identical. He sometimes explains how things have opposite qualities. So sea, he says, is the purest and most polluted water, for fish drinkable and healthy, for men undrinkable and harmful. Part of this is wordplay, and this is part of what philosophers do. But as we shall see, some believe that the power of words has an impact on reality itself. I put more in the notes about Heraclitus. But his doctrine of flux maintains that everything is in a state of constant flow, constant change. This would be a subject of much criticism for Plato, who argued that if you perceive flux, what you're actually perceiving is an error. It's not the way things truly are. It's an illusion that ultimately everything is one and unified. And we'll come back to that view in a minute and where Plato gets it from. But so Heraclitus is the last of the Ionians I'm going to talk about. We'll move on now to the next group of philosophers known as the Eleatics. So this school, probably founded by Parmenides, who we'll look at in a moment, in the early 5th century, was founded in the town of Elea or Velea in Italy. So this is part of Magna Graeca, Greater Greece as the Romans called it, and these are the Greek city-states in Italy, such as Acragas, Syracuse, Rhegium, Crotona, Metapontum, and Elea. Some of these city-states are large. They're on the scale of Athens. They have an interesting history about which we know relatively little because they didn't leave us a lot of writings. But they produced philosophers, some of which were influenced by the Ionians. Sometimes Xenophanes, that I'll talk about in a moment, is included in this list, though there's some dispute over this. And as I say, Elea was this Greek colony located in present-day Campania in southern Italy. And note that I've included the adventures of one of these philosophers. He's a bit later than the time that we're concerned with, so he's not a pre-Socratic. His famous voyage took place in 315 BC, but he's part of the Eleatic school, Pythias of Massalia. Massalia is a Greek colony in modern-day France. It's Marseille, was in what would become modern-day France. Pythias did something quite extraordinary. He sailed to Britain. He's the first Greek that we know of who came to Britain. He explored it. He reported on tin mining in Cornwall, amongst other things. And then he sailed further north. We're not sure exactly where he went. It's thought he might have gone to Iceland, but he observed the Arctic pack ice and reported back on it. So it's the first scientific account of that. And he measured the angle of the sun each day as he went. And using these measurements, the great philosopher Eratosthenes at Alexandria would calculate or recalculate the circumference of the Earth. And yes, by that point they knew it was a sphere, which was more accurate than Aristotle's calculation, thanks to Pythias's measurements. So quite an accomplishment. So some of these philosophers weren't just speculators, that they were engaged in practical research. But so Pythias aside for the moment, we'll go back to the pre-Socratics. And the first of these I want to talk about is Xenophanes of Colophon, a philosophically minded poet who lived in various parts of the ancient Greek world during the late 6th and 5th centuries. He's best remembered for a novel critique of the anthropomorphism in religion, a partial advance towards monotheism perhaps, and some pioneering reflections on the conditions of knowledge. So Xenophanes of Colophon questions the whether the gods look like us or not. Many later writers, perhaps influenced by the two brief characterizations of Xenophanes by Plato in the Sophist and Aristotle in the Metaphysics, identified him as the founder of the Eleatic school of philosophy. And their view is that despite appearances, what there is a changeless, motionless, and eternal one or unity, and this is what influences Plato's views. So we don't know if Xenophanes is the first of the Eleatics or if he's just one of the later ones, but he's a poet, he's a rhapsode, a singer of poetry who traveled around, and he's also introduced as a kind of philosopher scientist as well. We have a couple of fragments of his work in which he criticizes the stories told by Homer about the gods. So this is what he has to say. He writes, Homer and Hesiod have attributed to the gods all sorts of things and are matters of reproach and censure among men, theft, adultery, and mutual deception. As they sing of numerous illicit divine deeds, theft, adultery, and mutual deceit. So he's saying gods wouldn't behave like this, and Plato would pick up this view, as I've told you before as well, that the gods, as depicted in Homer, simply can't be gods, as we understand them, as they ought to be at any rate. So the basis with Xenophanes' unhappiness with the poet's account is not explained, but we may infer from the concluding call to pay due honor to the gods in Xenophanes' fragment B1, that an attribution of scandalous conduct would be incompatible with the goodness or perfection any divine being must assume to possess. And Aristotle, or Plato rather, agrees with this. We have two other well-known fragments of Xenophanes where he says, but mortals suppose that gods are born, wear their own clothes, and have a voice and body. Ethiopians say their gods are snub-nosed and black, Thracians that theirs are blue-eyed and red-haired. If horses and oxen had hands and could draw pictures, he writes, their gods would look remarkably like horses and oxen. So he seems to have been commenting on the folly of making gods, look like us. Um, he's not saying they don't exist, but his position appears to be that while no mortal being will ever know about the gods with any degree of certainty, we can at least avoid adopting beliefs and practices clearly at odds with, the truth of how they must be. And the special nature that any divine being must be assumed to possess. So, revolutionary, dangerous. This could have gotten him into trouble. We don't know enough about his life to know what happened to him, but still, an interesting concept. Now move to Parmenides. Parmenides is considered the founder of the Eleatic philosophy, at least, and certainly we can see in him this view that of universal oneness or monism, but known as the Parmenidean one. He was a Greek philosopher and poet born to an illustrious family in Elaea in Lower Italy, so Elaea, and the chief representative of the Eleatic school. He was admired for his exemplary life, and a Parmenidean life was proverbial among the Greeks. He was commonly represented as a disciple of Xenophanes. Parmenides wrote after Heraclitus and in conscious opposition to him. So his opposition to Heraclitus is picked up by Plato, given the evident allusion to Heraclitus stating, "For whom it was and is not the same, and not the same, and all things travel in opposite directions." Parmenides broke with the older Ionic prose tradition and wrote in hexameter verse. We have a little bit of his work surviving. His style was more like Hesiod and the Orphic poets. In the proem to his poem, we have the proem only, which is the introduction to it. We don't have the whole poem, but that's what we'll be looking at in class. Parmenides describes his ascent to the home of a goddess who is supposed to speak the remainder of the verses. This is a reflection of the conventional ascents into heaven, which were almost as common as descents into hell in apocalyptic literature of those days. Like what we might call a mystical initiation cult. Now, is he saying he actually experienced this? No, it's a story, it's a reasoning by analogy, but it's meant to give you a lesson. So the proem opens with Parmenides representing himself as borne on a chariot, attended by sun maidens who have quitted the halls of night to guide him on his journey. They pass along the highway till they come to the gate of night and day, which is barred. The key is in the keeping of Dike, Justice, the avenger, who is persuaded to unlock it by the sun maidens. They pass through the gate and are now in the realms of day. The goal of the journey is the palace of a goddess, an unnamed goddess, who welcomes Parmenides and instructs him in two ways, that of truth and the deceptive way of belief, in which there is no truth at all. It is clearly meant to indicate that Parmenides has been converted, that he's passed from error, from night to day, to illumination, to truth, and the two ways must represent his former error and the truth which is now revealed to him. In such mystical experience, however, the distinction between subject and object disappears, along with distinctions between objects generally, in addition to the fact that if nothing cannot be, it cannot be the object of thought. So this is one of the things the goddess tells him. She says, thinking and the thought that it is are the same, for you will not find thought apart from what is, what exists, in relation to which it is uttered. For thought and being are the same. It is necessary to speak and to think that which is, for being exists, but nothing does not exist. Helplessness guides the wandering thought in their breasts. They are carried along, deaf and blind alike, dazed beasts without judgment, convinced that to be and not to be are the same, and not the same, and that the road of all things is a backward turning one. It's dense stuff and difficult to unpack, but we can sort of get a few principles from it. One is that existence is eternal. That which truly exists has always been, is never becoming. That which is becoming has never been nothing, but will never actually be. So basically, nothing doesn't exist. And the goddess tells him, I forbid you to contemplate that which doesn't exist, because it doesn't exist. You can't think about what doesn't exist. As soon as you think about something, it exists. But it'll give you a headache, these things. So that which does exist is the Parmenidean one, which is timeless, uniform, and unchanging. And she goes on about this. So there's this difference between perceptions, what the senses tell us, which is that things change and are in a state of flux, as Heraclitus argues, but logos can show you beyond the truth, beyond sensory perception. Only logos will result in the understanding of the truth of the world. This is because the perception of things or appearances is deceptive. Beginning and ending, genesis and destruction, as Parmenides emphasizes, these are illusory things, because the underlying material of which a thing is made will still exist after its destruction. What exists must always exist. And again, quoting from the poem, for this view, that which is not exists can never predominate. Nothing, in other words, the view that nothing exists can never predominate. You must debar your thoughts from this way of search, nor let ordinary experience in its variety force you away along this way, namely that of following the eye, sightless as it is, and the ear full of sound, and the tongue to rule. But you must judge by means of the reason, the logos, the much contested proof which is expounded by me. So in this poem, yes, you get the notion of the Parmenidean one. This would be extremely influential on Plato and his views of the form of the good, and we've talked about this a bit before, and we'll talk about it again. I'm not suggesting you believe this, I'm just saying this is what he taught. So if that didn't give you a headache, the next one will, Zeno of Elea and his paradoxes. Now, I'm just going to introduce Zeno. I'm not going to go through the paradoxes because we'll do this in the seminar. But Zeno is another pre-Socratic philosopher from southern Italy, member of the Eleatic school. Aristotle called him the inventor of the dialectic. He's best known for his paradoxes, which the modern philosopher Bertrand Russell has described as immeasurably subtle, and profound. And I'm not going to go through these at all now, but I'm going to save it for the seminar because I want us to go through them. But as I say, Zeno is alleged to have invented the dialectic form, which Plato would use, a method of argumentation, and to have used complex word puzzles to try and explain, or at least offer some explanation for phenomena, and seems to have had an influence on the sophists as well, whom we'll be looking at. So like I say, we'll leave Zeno for now and save him for the seminar. And I'm leaving the Pythagoreans as well. They are heavily influenced by Eleatic philosophy, and will also heavily influence Plato, who's probably himself a Pythagorean. We'll deal with them next time, but I'm just going to mention them here as relevant pre-Socratic philosophers. Though we will talk about one of them now, Empedocles of Acragas, who was the student of Pythagoras, although so much is uncertain about these philosophers that it's a subject of great debate. So I'm going to talk about Empedocles of Acragas, who was probably a student of Pythagoras, but again, like I say, there is some uncertainty about that. He introduces the concept of the four elements, or roots, as they're called, rhizomata. That gives us the word rhizome, if you're familiar with that in modern botany. And they are earth, air, fire, and water. And the two forces of love and strife, or attraction and repulsion, as he's defining them. His philosophy, and we have a poem of his as well, which we'll be looking at in class. So his philosophy is best known for being the originator of the cosmogenic theory of the four classical elements. He also proposes powers, as I say, love and strife, which would act as forces to bring about the mixture and separation of the elements. These physical speculations were part of a history of the universe, which also dealt with the origin and development of life influenced by the Pythagoreans. He supported also the doctrine of reincarnation. Empedocles, like the Ionian philosophers and the atomists, and we'll come to the atomists in a moment, tried to find the basis of all things. They did not, like Heraclitus, consider coming into existence and motion as the existence of all things, and rest and tranquility as non-existence. This is because they had derived from the Eleatics the conviction that an existence could not pass into non-existence and vice versa. So they reject that notion of non-existence in agreement with Parmenides. So, as I say, Empedocles establishes these four elements, which make up all the structures in the world: earth, air, fire, and water. He called them roots, which in typical fashion he also identified with the mythical names of the gods: Zeus, Hera, Nestis, and Hydonius. Now, these, I've said, of course, these philosophers are meant to be describing the world without recourse to mythology, but we've seen Parmenides use mystical or mythological language, as with Empedocles too. It looks like we're not meant to take these things literally. He's using these gods for their symbolic significance, a bit like how in later Christian eras the gods would be invoked for their abstract meaning, as opposed to an actual belief in them. Empedocles, like the atomists, found the real processes which correspond to what is popularly termed growth, increase, or decrease, and he argued that nothing new comes or can come into being. The only change that can occur is a change in the juxtaposition, the placement of element with element. This theory of the four elements became the standard dogma for the next 2,000 years. These four elements are eternally brought into union and eternally parted from each other by the divine powers of love and strife, or attraction and repulsion. Love explains the attraction of different forms of matter, and strife accounts for their separation. If the elements are the content of the universe, then love and strife explain their variation and harmony. Love and strife are attractive and repulsive forces which the ordinary eye can see working amongst people, but which really pervade the universe. They alternately hold empire over things, neither, however, being ever quite absent. Empedocles also believed in reincarnation, following the teachings of Pythagoras, and this in many respects follows from their belief, or from the belief of the Eleatic philosophers, that everything is ultimately one. So the soul, in a sense, recycles. It comes back. So like Pythagoras, Empedocles believed in the transmigration of the soul, that souls can be reincarnated between humans, animals, and even plants. For Empedocles, all living things were on the same spiritual plane. Plants and animals are links in a chain, where humans are a link too. He urged a vegetarian lifestyle, which was in keeping with the Pythagorean beliefs, since the bodies of animals are the dwelling places of punished souls. Wise people who have learned the secret of life are next to the divine, and their souls, free from the cycle of reincarnations, are able to rest in happiness for eternity. This is strikingly similar to reincarnation beliefs found in Hinduism, and it is thought that perhaps filtering through that East meets West phenomenon in Ionia, some of these views may have come across, although there are no Hindus at this point, there's the Vedic tradition out of which Hinduism derives, and it may be that these views were around. We'll talk more about Empedocles in class, because we've got a work of his that survives to look at. The next philosophers I'll mention are two, Democritus and Leucippus, and these are the atomists. And this may surprise you if you didn't know already that the ancient Greeks came up with atoms. Atomism was one of the theories of ancient Greek natural philosophy, devised to explain the universe. The atoms, from the Greek word meaning unable to be cut, in other words, atomos, that which cannot be cut, were seen as indivisible. So they were the smallest unit of something and indivisible. If you had a magic knife, it could keep cutting something until you reached the atom, in which case you couldn't cut it anymore. So they got it close to right, but not quite. These atoms had a few innate properties, like size, shape, order, and position. They could hit each other in the void. By hitting one another and locking together, they became something else. The philosophy explained the material of the universe and is called materialist philosophy. So Democritus himself, and he's not; these aren't Eleatic philosophers. These are mainland Greece philosophers. Democritus was from Abdera in Thrace. He was an influential pre-Socratic and probably the pupil of Leucippus, although there's some uncertainty about which one came first. Leucippus is credited with having invented atomic theory, and Democritus develops some other aspects of it. But again, we don't know which one came first, and we don't know which one came up with the philosophy of atoms. As I say, his exact contributions, Democritus, are difficult to disentangle from Leucippus. Their speculation on atoms bears a passing and partial resemblance to 19th century understanding of atomic structure. And this has led some to regard Democritus as more of a scientist than other Greek philosophers. These views were largely ignored in Athens at the time. Although Democritus was also well known to his fellow northern-born philosopher Aristotle. Plato is said to have disliked him so much that he wished his books burned. Many consider Democritus the founder of modern science rather. Plato believed that maybe atoms exist, but beyond atoms are the forms. So the atom is not the ultimate thing. The theory of Democritus and Leucippus held that everything is composed of atoms, which are physically but not geometrically indivisible. That between atoms lies empty space, the void. That atoms are indestructible, have always been and always will be in motion. That there are an infinite number of atoms and kinds of atoms which differ in shape and size. They reasoned that the solidness of the material corresponded with the shape of the atoms. So iron atoms were strong and solid with hooks on them that lock them into place. Water atoms were smooth and slippery. Salt atoms, because of their taste, are sharp and pointed. And air atoms are light, whirling, pervading other atoms. So again, not quite right, but an amazing leap forward to even come up with this concept of atoms without being able to test it, without being able to prove it. The theory of atoms appears to be the most nearly aligned with that of any modern science, aligned with modern science than any other theory in antiquity. Though you've got to be careful that we're not trying to fit our views too closely to theirs. So how did they come up with atoms? How could someone envision this? One obvious solution is to explain how invisible properties can be conveyed in a way not easily visible to human beings, is to hypothesize the existence of atoms. So these classical atoms are actually nearer to our modern concept of the molecule than to the atoms of modern science. The other big point of classical atomism is that there must be a lot of open space between these atoms, namely the void. In addition, Democritus was the first to observe, he made some mathematical accomplishments too, to observe that the cone or pyramid has 1/3 the volume of the cylinder or prism, respectively, with the same base and height. Also, that a cone divided in a plane parallel to its base produces two surfaces. Important geometric discoveries. The other philosopher, the one who may have come up with the idea first, though we're not sure, is Leucippus, and his contribution seems to have been to admit the vacuum, an idea that the Eleatic philosophers would largely disagree with, that the vacuum, the void, simply cannot exist. But for the atomic theory, a void is necessary. Now, like I say, this idea of atoms of the ancient Greeks would be profoundly influential on us, but not for a long time. It had a more direct impact on the philosophy of the Epicurean philosophers who come later on in the 3rd century. They believed that everything was made of atoms, following this doctrine rather closely, and specifically the soul is made of atoms. So when you die, the soul just disperses, and there's no life after death. This view would go down very, very badly with the Christians. So when Christianity dominates, the atomists and the Epicureans' views are widely suppressed. But a surviving treatise by a Roman writer named Lucretius, the text is called De Rerum Natura, on the nature of the universe, did survive, and it contained in it a very good description of atomic theory, as developed by Democritus and Leucippus, and as used by the Epicureans. It was rediscovered in the 18th century by a modern scientist, or early modern scientist, named Pierre Gassendi, who then formulated an atomic theory. He had to make the theory a bit more compatible with Christianity than the pagan Greek one, but Gassendi's atomic theory then goes to form the basis of the modern atomic theories. And so it's not an accident that Greek atomism is very similar to 19th century concepts of the atom, because they are derived from the same thing. And as a result, it may be safely said that we would not have atomic weapons, atomic energy, atomic science today without these inventions of the ancient Greeks. So if you ever think that ancient philosophy has no purpose whatsoever other than to contemplate weird things, the atomists seem to prove us wrong, for better or worse. But again, this is what they have achieved. So that's our introduction to the pre-Socratic philosophers and their ideas. We will see a bit more closely how another pre-Socratic group of philosophers next week, the Pythagoreans, would then go on to impact a range of things, including Plato, but also the science of mathematics and musicology. Thank you very much for your attention. Goodbye for now.